Hello dear students, today I am Dr. Prinpreet Kaur. I am here to discuss with you a new topic, that is limits of law, the Coase theorem part 1. To introduce this theorem, I'll tell you the Coase theorem was developed by popular economist Ronald Coase, and this theorem is a significant theory that explains property rights. Actually, Ronald Coase had developed the theorem while he was contemplating radio frequency regulation, but he elaborated on the fact that radio stations that benefited the most from using a certain frequency to transmit their content had a reasonable reason to pay some money to other broadcasters so as to prevent them from interfering. This is how he propagated that there was no need to regulate the frequencies. The Coase theorem, as the theory is called, is what enables the issue of property rights to lie at the interface between law and economics. The Coase theorem states that under the conditions of pure competition, where there are no transaction costs and there exists an efficient set of inputs and outputs, the choice that will be exercised in such a state will be considered optimal. The Coase theorem essentially explains that on matters related to property rights, when individual people or members of groups try to bargain, it induces a more optimal and efficient outcome regardless of the nature of the outcome. The theorem applies in situations of conflict between property rights, and it helps to understand the fact that whenever there is a conflict on property rights, the associated parties can either bargain or negotiate in the situation and make efforts to reach an outcome that is completely indicative of the costs and the fundamental value of the property right. Such a solution will certainly be the most economically efficient solution. However, arriving at such an effective outcome is only conditional on the fact that there exists an efficient and competitive market condition where there are no transaction costs and the information available is also free and perfect. A major proposition on which the Coase theorem is based is that if the transacting parties enter into a bargain, then the transaction cost must be zero, because if there are monetary costs incurred in the process of bargaining or negotiations in the form of meetings, then it affects the outcome of the process. To ensure that the bargaining power of the transacting parties is equal and in any way does not affect the outcome of the negotiation between them, it is important that neither of the parties has a greater competitive advantage over the other in the market. The Coase theorem establishes that the parties involved in a property right dispute do not assign any consideration to how the rights are distributed under specific circumstances between the parties. Rather, they are more concerned with their present and future income and rent without paying any attention to non-economic factors like social equity, human sentiments, etc. From the point of view of economics, Ronald Coase explained that the legislative system should aim to provide a set of rights in such a way that can enable the attainment of economic efficiency. Transaction costs in any system are usually influenced by the legal system, and the overarching aim of this system is to reduce harm or costs. Keeping this in mind, Coase used the example of crop damage brought on by wandering cattle to illustrate the significance of transaction costs while also examining the structure of potential contracts or bargaining. He pointed out that if law helps the rights to be well defined, then the deliberations between the involved parties can provide a permanent and an efficient solution under the conventional assumptions of competitive markets, specifically assuming that in the process of negotiations, the transaction costs are zero. It is also imperative to ascertain the liability of a business firm for any ensuing harm, because market transactions for transferring and recombining rights cannot occur in the absence of this initial delimitation of rights. However, if the pricing mechanism is considered to operate irrespective of the cost, the final outcome, which maximizes the value of production, will remain unaffected by the legal framework of the country. The Coase theorem, is often interpreted as a counter argument against the legislative or the regulatory administration of disputes involving property rights and their privately negotiated resolutions. Now, let us first discuss the conditions that are required for the application of the Coase theorem. In economics, one of the primary causes of market inefficiency is externalities. These are the benefits or the costs inflicted on those parties who were not participating in the transaction. Externalities are a common phenomena and can manifest in a variety of ways, including noise pollution, traffic jams, pollution, and even beneficial outcomes like the exchange of information and education. The major concern with the issue of externalities is that they might result in inefficient resource allocation by the market or market inefficiencies. The Coase theorem gives private parties a strong opportunity for negotiation by demonstrating that they can work out an optimal solution to the problem of externality if property rights are clearly defined and if transaction costs are minimal. The conditions on which the applicability of the Coase theorem relies are: number 1, efficient market conditions. That is, for the Coase theorem to apply, it is important that the market conditions around the disputable property should be efficient and competitive, because if this is not so, then a viable solution cannot be attained. In the real world, where transaction costs are a usual phenomena, information regarding market conditions is never perfect. Market dominance is a common feature, and most markets for final goods and factor inputs fall short of the requirements for a perfectly competitive market. The assumption of zero transaction or bargaining costs, complete information about the market, no differences in market power, and highly effective markets for the production of goods and use of factors of production are obviously difficult to meet. Since the conditions essential for the application of the Coase theorem in real life situations of disputes pertaining to the distribution of property rights do not exist outside of extremely idealized economic conditions, its relevance to the applied field of law and economics is put under a scanner. Understanding this limitation of the application of the Coase theorem, the economists perceive it as an explanation as to why there exist so many apparently ineffective solutions to economic issues in the real world, instead of discerning it as a norm or guideline for the resolution of disputes. Now, let us first discuss the low transaction costs. Transaction costs are also a significant component of the applicability of the Coase theorem. Transaction costs may be defined as the cost or expenditure incurred on events like assimilating information, scheduling meetings for the purpose of negotiating, enforcing the agreement, or even simply monitoring or ensuring compliance with the agreement. It is only when the transaction costs in a dispute are low that the negotiating parties can reach an efficient outcome in the bargaining process. If, however, the transaction costs in the process are very high, then the outcome that the parties might reach would not be an efficient one, even if the property rights are properly defined in the system. Talking about perfect knowledge about the market, the Coase theorem is based on the presumption that all participants in the negotiation process possess perfect information about the market and are logical in their approach. This, however, is not always true in practice because the parties may not have complete knowledge of the cause and benefits of the transaction, and they might possess varying preferences, attitudes, and perspectives also. Even in cases where property rights are well defined and transaction costs are negligible, this might lead to an efficient bargaining outcome. Let us now discuss what are well-defined property rights. The foundation of the Coase theorem is the notion that the distribution of property rights may influence how the parties involved in an externality negotiate an agreement. The parties will have to settle on the issue of the allocation of rights first if property rights are not clearly established, which can turn out to be an expensive and time-consuming affair. On the contrary, if property rights are clearly specified, the parties can immediately discuss the terms of agreement without bothering about the allocation of rights. To sum up, the Coase theorem offers an effective framework for comprehending how private parties can bargain and resolve the issue of an externality in a way that benefits both the sides. Despite its shortcomings, it is nonetheless a very valuable resource for the economists, for the policymakers, and every person who seeks to gain insight into how markets operate in real life. Now we move forward to understand the working of the Coase theorem. When the economic behavior of one party causes the property of another party to be damaged, the Coase theorem comes into effect. On the basis of the negotiations between the disputing parties, one party might either offer funds to the other party so as to make up for their own actions, or pay an incentive to the party whose activity causes damages so as to prevent that action, depending upon the negotiations that take place during the process. For example, if a company that manufactures machines in a factory receives a noise complaint from the residents in the neighborhood because they are disturbed by the loud noises of the machinery being manufactured, the Coase theorem would suggest two possible outcomes. One, if the neighbors can be persuaded to pay the business to stop making noise, the business will either cease to create the noise altogether to make up for the extra expenses or lost revenue involved in curtailing the noise, or it may opt to provide financial compensation to the people living in the neighborhood so that he continues to be permitted to make the noise. Now, since neither party would be ready to pay the other any compensation, the result would be that business as usual would carry on without any monetary transaction being carried out between the parties. If the monetary worth of the machines being made in the noisy environment is much more than the value of the damages that the businessman might have to pay to the people in the neighborhood, then an efficient and optimal outcome would be achieved if the business is allowed to continue to operate and simply compensate the neighbors for the noise from the profit that it generates. If, however, the returns received by the business from the production of the machines are less than the cost incurred by the neighboring residents because of the noise generated by the business from its machine production, then the business will most likely terminate its activities if it receives compensation from the neighbors. Nevertheless, in real-world conditions, no neighbor would ever pay an enterprise any compensation just to prevent them from producing machines, because the cost paid in the form of compensation would be much more than the worth they assign to living in a noise-free environment. Another case where the Coase theorem can be seen to be applicable is the concept of externalities. The costs and benefits of economic activity that are not reflected in market prices are known as externalities. These externalities may be either positive or negative, and conventional economic analysis often tends to disregard them. When products and services are not distributed effectively because of the action of externalities, market failures are said to occur, which would further reduce the overall welfare of the society. These market failures can be addressed with the use of the Coase theorem, which offers a framework for negotiating externalities between the transacting parties. It is critical to take into account a variety of perspectives in order to completely comprehend the concept of externalities. Pollution can be seen as a natural outcome of production that will have to be met in order to reach a specific amount of output based on the viewpoint of the producer. Pollution, however, as seen from the society's standpoint, is considered to be a negative externality that places costs on others in the form of health issues and causes harm to the environment. This highlights the need for policies that internalize external costs and make producers responsible for the negative impact of their activities. As has already been discussed in the previous modules, externalities can be positive or negative, and pollution is one such negative externality that causes market failure because the market prices of the goods do not reflect the cost inflicted on society because of pollution. In case of externalities, the Coase theorem can provide a solution to the problem and allow for negotiation between the parties without the need for the government to interfere. The use of the Coase theorem to solve this problem requires that the external cost of pollution may be internalized and hence lead to an efficient allocation of resources between the transacting parties. In cases where property rights are not properly defined or transaction costs are too high, there is a need for government intervention, because under such circumstances, it would be difficult for the parties to negotiate and reach an efficient outcome. Under these conditions, external costs and benefits can be internalized through the interference of the government in the form of imposition of taxes or the provision of subsidies. Now, there is some criticism that has been posed to the Coase theorem, and we will discuss that also. The Coase theorem has drawn criticism from a variety of sources despite having been recognized as one of the greatest contributions ever made to the understanding of the concept of externalities. While some critics have observed that the theory ignores the effect of transaction costs on bargaining, Others contend that it is founded on irrational assumptions. There are apprehensions regarding the applicability of the Coase theorem, especially under conditions where there are a large number of transacting parties, each of whom has a separate set of choices and objectives. Some grounds on which the Coase theorem has been criticized are: first, the unrealistic assumptions. An important ground of criticism of the Coase theorem is that it is based on unrealistic assumptions regarding the nature of bargaining. The theory, however, assumes that both transacting parties possess perfect knowledge about market conditions, which is why they are in a position to negotiate absolutely without incurring any transaction costs. But from the point of view of practical applicability, if we look at it closer, this is an unreal situation because neither the transactions can be carried out free of any cost, nor is there any perfect information available to the transacting parties in the market. Moreover, there are other deterrents like market dominance or barriers to communication that may make the negotiation process more complicated. Another point of criticism is the transaction cost. The Coase theorem is also criticized for failing to consider how transaction costs affect bargaining. The expenditures incurred during the negotiation process and in the implementation of the agreement, including the time spent in discussions, legal fee, and administrative expenditures, are referred to as the transaction costs. Reaching a solution in conformity with the Coase theorem might be a daunting task, especially if the negotiating process is rendered difficult or unattainable because of the large transaction costs. Another criticism arises because of the disputes between multiple parties. The application of the Coase theorem also relies on the assumption that there are only two negotiating parties in the dispute and each party has their own property rights established. This, however, is again in contravention of reality because in real life situations there are often disputes or circumstances wherein various parties are involved, and since each one of those parties has varied interests and conflicting objectives, reaching a Coase theorem based solution is also an arduous task. One more point of criticism is the concerns pertaining to the distribution of benefits. Lastly, certain critics contend that problems concerned with distributional gains are also ignored by the Coase theorem. According to the theory, if the parties negotiate with each other, they will reach a Pareto optimal solution, which means that no party can become better without making any other party worse off. But there is quite a likelihood that after the transaction, the outcome obtained on the basis of Coase theorem is not judiciously fair, especially if one side has a greater bargaining power than the other. Now, I conclude my entire lecture in the following words. The Coase theorem, developed by economist Ronald Coase, is a crucial theory that explains issues related to property rights. This theory applies to property rights conflicts, allowing the parties to negotiate and reach an economically efficient outcome. However, this effectiveness depends upon efficient market conditions with no transaction costs and perfect information. The Coase theorem asserts that if parties enter into a bargain, transaction costs must be zero, as the monetary cost can affect the outcome. The Coase theorem suggests that property rights disputes often focus on issues pertaining to income and rent and attach no significance to non-economic factors like social equity and human sentiments. The legislative system should therefore aim to protect and provide property rights so as to promote economic efficiency. While the transaction costs incurred in a negotiation may be influenced by the legal system, the ultimate objective of such a legislative system is only to ensure equal bargaining power and avoid the deterrence caused by market dominance. The theorem applies only under specific conditions of the market, such as perfect knowledge about the market, very low or negligible transaction costs, efficient market conditions, and very well defined property rights. In the absence of any of these conditions, however, the Coase theorem ceases to hold good in its application. The idea of externalities, which is defined as the costs and benefits of economic activity that are not reflected in the form of market prices, is an aspect that reveals the application of Coase's theorem. The existence of such externalities can lead to market failures, which lower the welfare of the society. A framework for negotiating these externalities between the parties involved in the transaction can be provided by the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem has faced criticism for its reliance on unrealistic and irrational assumptions. Critics argue that the theory ignores the impact of transaction costs on bargaining and fails to consider the difficulties incurred during negotiations due to large transaction costs. The theory also fails to account for disputes between multiple parties where each party has different interests and objectives, making it difficult to reach a solution. These criticisms highlight the need for a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the externalities and the impact of transaction costs on bargaining. To conclude, it can be stated that the Coase theorem is still a useful resource for comprehending concepts like externalities that can be negotiated in a contemporary context. Even though the theorem's application can be complicated and multidimensional, it is quite desirable to use the potential of the theory to develop solutions that can be beneficial to all the concerned parties by taking into account the significance of well-defined property rights, the role of government action, and the significance of cooperation and collaboration among the transacting parties. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you very much.